Welcome, everyone, to the Spiritual Brew Pub. I'm your host, Michael Camp. And today's podcast, we have a fascinating guest who has an amazing story. He's going to tell us about his experience in the evangelical movement. Rob Schenck is an evangelical minister, an author, a top cast member of two acclaimed documentaries, and also the president of the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Institute. Rob, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Michael. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, well, I'm so glad you're on, and we're going to have a great conversation today. I want to tee it up a little bit, though, and kind of start with some of the things that we have in common. I think we both got involved in the evangelical movement in the 70s and the 80s. Is that true for you?
Right.
Okay. Yep. And we were both in ministry. You as a minister and me as a missionary. Both very active in Operation Rescue. We're going to hear about that. The pro-life anti-abortion organization that did sit-ins in front of clinics. And I think you were a prominent leader in that movement. And I was a participant in two rescues in Los Angeles back in the day, way back in 1989. Both of us went through changes that's helped us, that started us down a path where we looked at some of these issues like abortion and gun rights and some others very differently. And what I'm really interested in today, and I'm very impressed with, is the lessons that you have learned in your experience. And you spell those out in your book, Costly Grace, an evangelical minister's rediscovery of faith, hope, and love, and in the two documentaries that you've participated in, Armor of Light and AKA Jane Roe. So just to give the conversation some context, maybe at a bird's eye view, could you often say that you gone through three conversions. In summary, what are those conversions?
Yeah, well, Michael, the three are probably really 300.
Okay. All right. All right. The three main ones that open up other ones.
Exactly. Three summary conversions, right. Because life is never that simple, as we both know. Yep. But yeah, I would say that, the mile markers, if you will, on the lifeline for me would be the first conversion that happened when I was in my late teens. This was the mid-1970s. Mm-hmm. And I was invited to a small country church. At that time I was a non-religious, kind of skeptic. I guess I had a belief in God, but I had been raised in a nominally Jewish home and didn't know much about church or Christianity. So I was invited by the son of a Methodist minister to a Friday night prayer service at his church, and I ducked in more out of curiosity than anything else and heard the minister talk about the Jesus of the Sermon on the Mount, mm-hmm. the Son of God, blessing peacemakers, which resonated with me because my first act of protest was against the Vietnam War. I was very much anti-war at that time. Mm-hmm. Am again today, but wasn't mm-hmm. in the interim. But in any case, that resonated. And then, of course, he blessed the poor, the marginalized, the oppressed, those who were in prison. And I said, boy, I like this guy. I like this message. And it was in that place that I eventually made a public profession of Christian faith. And it revolutionized my life. I truly was born again. And that's how I described myself at the mm-hmm. time, as a born again Christian. I made Jesus the Lord and Savior of my life and endeavored to emulate him, to follow him. So a couple of years later, when I turned 18, and could cast my first vote for president, I looked for the guy who looked the most like the Jesus I met that night in that little country church. And I found him. in Jimmy Carter, a
I
Democrat.
knew you were going to say that.
So I cast my first presidential vote for Jimmy Carter. I'm chagrined to tell you that I wouldn't vote for a Democrat again for 40 years.
Yeah, right. Yeah, because
Because
yeah, that was, you didn't vote for the right person. Let's straighten you out here, Rob.
I was later told that
Yeah, exactly. I got that
quite
same type of
emphatically.
thing. Yeah,
Yeah, how dare you?
right.
Of course, that goes to my second conversion, because by the mid 1980s, I had been to Bible college. In our
Hmm.
wing of the evangelical movement, we typically did not go to seminary, which is a graduate level education. We went to Bible school, which is 3 years of training
Hmm.
for Christian ministry. And I'd been ordained and eventually took my seat at the table of national Christian leadership in the National Association of Evangelicals, where I served on several committees. And we were the first body of evangelical leaders to be addressed by a sitting president, namely Ronald Reagan.
Right, right. Interesting. Yeah.
And it was under that presidential aura, glow, that I underwent what I now call my second conversion to Ronald Reagan Republican religion,
Hmm.
which is distinctly different from Christianity, and most
Yes.
certainly
Yeah.
the opposite of what I first saw in Jesus back in
Right.
the mid 70s. And I would spend 35 years or so, taking a journey to the right wing of American evangelicalism, until finally I had to come to terms with what I was seeing in the movement I was helping to lead at the time. By the early 1990s, I was situated in Washington, D.C., literally on Capitol Hill, with a ministry headquarters building across the street from the Supreme Court, 1 minute from the Capitol and 10 minutes from the White House. I was in the epicenter of American politics, and I was using my position to influence elected and appointed officials to embrace the values I thought would benefit America and reflect Christian principles the most. But it was in that political work that I came to realize that we were actually contradicting what I now call the ministry message and mission of Christ.
Right. That's
And so
amazing.
I had to come to terms with that, and it was
Right.
very jarring. Can I tell you one little detailed part of
Yeah,
that?
sure. Go ahead. Yeah. Hmm.
If we have the time, I'll just
Yep.
tell you that I had taken a leave of absence to do my late in life doctoral work at my alma mater, Faith Evangelical Seminary in Tacoma, Washington. And I was in the dusty, dingy basement library reading through some history on the evangelical church in Nazi Germany,
Hmm.
only to discover that one of the sources I was trained to repeatedly go to throughout my ministerial career, the New Testament Dictionary of Theology, edited by Gerhard Kittel. You probably have one on your shelf.
Oh, right. The Kittle commentary. Right. Yeah.
Yes. And I
Yes.
was told, like you probably were, never prepare a sermon
Yeah.
without consulting Kittel. Go to
Yeah.
Kittel.
Yeah.
My Bible college professors would say, have you checked Kittel on that? So I was trained to do that, and I did it for 40 years.
Hmm.
But no one ever bothered to tell me that Gerhard Kittel was Adolf Hitler's resident theologian that gave him
Oh my gosh.
theological justification for genocide.
Oh my gosh. That's incredible.
And I had to
Wow.
wonder, why was I never informed about this? Why
Yes.
didn't anyone ever discuss it? And I think
Right.
there's reasons it was
Yeah.
never discussed. But I'm saying that because that was one of the very jarring moments that propelled me
To
to my third conversion,
right.
which took me back to that Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount with the help of my favorite dead German, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a
Yeah.
courageous, brave, brilliant young
Right.
church leader who challenged
Right.
Adolf Hitler and was murdered for his resistance to
Right.
Nazism. So that led to a massive change in my life and work. But that's the summary of the three.
Wow, that's amazing. I can relate to a lot of that. It's almost like I had a very similar experience. I mean, I had this, great spiritual experience. I was very amazed by Jesus's teachings. They were just revolutionary. And then you get into the church, and it's like, oh, you can't be a pacifist, Michael. Oh, you can't do this. You can't vote Democrat. You can, all this stuff. And it just kind of slowly changes you. And and it's just like you said, one day if you're really honest, you wake up and go, actually, we're not on the path of Christ anymore. What's going on? So I completely relate to everything you said. One of the things is that I wonder, like, do we just make compromises? Like a young person who reads the Gospels and is enamored with Christ, and then they just get into this movement, churches, institutions, training. How do evangelicals get sucked into a politicized faith?
Yeah, that's at once, I think, a simple question and a very, very complex one. But as you just described, and by the way, it's so nice to discover you as a companion on this otherwise fairly lonely journey.
Yeah.
There aren't many, and Jesus said so. He said the narrow road is one that very few people travel. So it's lonely, but it's not empty. And I find a few souls like yourself, pilgrims on the narrow way. And that's wonderful. And I discover more and more of them as time goes on. But, I think there's something that cuts both ways here, because we all have a need to be part of a community, to be connected to people, to belong, to be welcomed. And so it was certainly one of the things that propelled me towards Christian faith and community. It was like an extended family.
Yes.
And that was really important to me. At the same time, just like any family, the Christian family can be very abusive, massively dysfunctional. The communities I've been a part of and that I've led and that I've contributed dysfunction to were certainly that way. And so, we put demands, it's almost like people are teased. You can come in and you can sit with us and you can be with us and we'll even love on you initially. But then you have to meet some demands, some criteria. If you want to stay here, if you want to be fully embraced, if you want access, to places of meaning and service, then you've got to start meeting these demands and measuring up. And these are all things I think completely contradict the gospel, which is an expansive, limitless welcome to community and to relationship with God and with one another. So once we start putting these parameters around it and saying, yes, you are welcome if you do these things, if you live in these ways, if you reflect these beliefs and practices, then you can stay. But otherwise, we're going to at least give you the cold shoulder and possibly muscle you out.
Right. No,
and I experienced all of those things.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. The initial honeymoon stage is nice. You're loved into this community. You're you're welcomed, and especially if you initially go through and accept Christ and become a born again Christian and all this stuff, get baptized. And then you find out it's transactional. It's like, okay, yeah, this is not going to go on forever. Now the transactions have to come up. And, it could be very, depending on your community or church affiliation, it could be more prayer and Bible study or prayer meetings early in the morning, or it could be, you have to believe, here's a statement of faith. You got to believe all this stuff. And if you don't believe this stuff, then you really can't become a member, and, on and on. And really it's just making a bunch of clones at the end of the day that everyone looks and sounds alike. And I mean, there's all kinds of things. And then you brought up the abuse, of course. And because when you have a very narrow way of looking at the world, and you've got you a claim that the Bible says X, Y, and Z, and you've got to follow everything to a T, then they just make that into a way of life that really is like spiritually abusive, as you very well know.
Yes.
You cannot you cannot have out the road is so narrow that you cannot just be even on the fringe. You have to be right there, or else you're corrected, you're manipulated, you're all kinds of things. So we're certainly on the same page with that. But one of the things that I was very struck with was your addressing the gun culture in Christianity. And it sounded like this is in the documentary Armor of Light, folks. This is a great documentary you should watch. And you realize that your fellow Christians are much more pro-gun than you ever thought, and you're trying to reconcile, can you be pro-gun and pro-life? What's going on? So what prompted that? How did that work out? How did you discover this pro-gun culture, and how did you handle it?
Well, I hadn't thought much about it. In 30 plus years of national evangelical leadership, I hadn't thought much about popular gun culture, and particularly its embrace by my fellow evangelical Christians. But, more and more data was coming in. Of course, Michael, you remember, I'm sure as well as I do, the agony when our folks, our pro-life folks, quote unquote, started shooting doctors and clinic staff,
right,
and others. And of course, that had started with bombing and destroying properties. So violence had entered the movement, and that was jarring. But I dismissed it by conveniently sort of putting it in a box and saying that's a rarity, it's an anomaly. These people are invaders.
We did that too. I was in Operation Rescue. We'll talk about that later. But yeah, those are the other guys. Those are the extremists. We're not extreme. We
Right.
and you do that for everything. You do that. Whenever some crazy thing happens and someone bases it on evangelical or conservative Christian beliefs, oh, we're not like that. We're not that bad. But you got to look a little bit closer to see how, whether maybe you are contributing to it. Is that the kind of thing you're saying?
Yeah, and literally so, because I'll tell you, with one of those notorious gun murders of an abortion provider, the leaders that I kept company with, we were very quick to make public statements denouncing it, and rightfully so. And I feel good about that part.
Right.
We called it unchristian, we called it cowardly, we called it criminal, we called it immoral, and we denounced it. And thinking, these people are coming from somewhere else, and maybe they're even plants. We would make that excuse.
Oh yeah,
oh, these
from
are the
Antifa.
other side. Yes.
Right.
In the days before Antifa, or we would have named Antifa.
Yeah, right, yeah.
So, then somebody sent me a photo of one of our press conferences where the perpetrator of that murder is standing right alongside me in a photo. I didn't know him at the time.
Wow.
I didn't even remember that news conference, but there it was. In other words, he was close enough that he was in our lineup. I may not have known him personally, but he was definitely embedded in our movement.
Yeah.
Yes, we would do everything we could to justify our own consciences, to exempt ourselves from culpability or accountability. And I did that pretty effectively for most of those years. But I would hear from time to time, for example, a longtime friend of mine, a Baptist minister I had known for many years and had been and was very involved in Operation Rescue and other wings of the pro-life movement. And one day he says to me, you know, Rob, I never go into the pulpit without my sidearm, without my handgun.
Never go into the pulpit.
Dave, what? What? I said, well, what are you talking about? He said,
Oh my
look,
God.
look. And he pulled back his jacket and he's got a 9mm semi-automatic handgun on his belt. And I said, what are you doing? What are you thinking? And he said, anybody comes into my church and stands up and says something I don't understand in a language I don't understand, I'll take him right out from the sacred desk.
What?
And I said, okay, brother, you know, we affectionately refer to each other as brother and sister. I said, look, brother, you know as well as I do, when you fire that round, you can't control where it's going. So let me just take you this far. When you miss that guy and you shoot a grandma and maybe her granddaughter sitting next to her, how are you going to recover from that? And he said, that's the price we have to pay to guard the sheep.
Oh my gosh, I can't believe that.
Okay, so I said, we are in a very bad way here.
Just let me know, how long ago was this? What was this in time?
I want to say that had to be somewhere around 2010.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, when I was just thinking back in the day when I was embedded in the church, I just can't imagine that being happening. I mean, I remember people saying, yeah, I'd grab a gun and protect my family and shoot the guy who comes in the door, but not bring a gun up into the pulpit. I mean, or now the big thing is, oh yeah, I want my congregation armed if possible,
Absolutely.
That's amazing. That's
Absolutely.
just incredible.
And and that's it. I mean, it happened incrementally and then reached a certain tipping point.
Right.
And this is where I sometimes go to my show and tell, Michael, I know I asked you permission to do this.
Oh, yes.
May I
go ahead. This is a very important thing to see. It's disturbing, but important.
It is disturbing. And I just want to say, if anyone is a survivor of gun violence, a victim of gun violence, you may not want to watch this this little illustration here. Not that it involves a real firearm. You're not going to see a real firearm here. I just want to put you at ease about that. But I do want you to see this because I think it's very telling about the trouble we are in as an evangelical culture in the United States. This looks like what you might assume it to be, either a Bible, or actually when you see the zipper case, these handy snazzy zippers, it usually indicates a Bible cover that's meant to protect your favorite Bible volume. And a lot of evangelicals carry these routinely. I did for many years. I now use the digital Bible, but back in the day. But a whole lot of Christians still use a paper Bible, and I love paper. So I have lots of paper volumes, but this is meant to protect it. And, it's a nice cover. It has the embossed Holy Bible on the front, a nice silver cross on the spine. It has this handy zipper so that you can protect your favorite Bible pages from dirt and dust and rain and whatever other contaminants might come its way. And of course, you can slip note paper and highlighters, and evangelicals take a lot of notes, especially during the preaching of a sermon. So these are very popular, and this happens to be one of the most popular Bible covers sold in America. The only problem is when you open it, and I guess for those who are only listening, I'll describe this as best I can if you can't see it. But when you open this Bible cover, the problem is there's no room inside for Holy Writ. There's no room for the scriptures, for a Bible volume to be contained in it. The only thing that this Bible cover will contain is this, a semi-automatic pistol. This is plastic, by the way, folks. This is not a real weapon, but it's the same dimensions as a real weapon. And the manufacturer of this Bible cover, Garrison Grip of Ohio, brags that it's one of their most popular products, and it will contain any semi-automatic handgun, Sig Sauer 226, a Glock 9mm, and they even were sure to include enough room for an additional magazine so that you never run out of ammunition. Now, when you think about this, one of the things I like to say, and Michael, you heard me say it in Armor of Light in the film, we have to be careful that in respecting the Second Amendment to the US Constitution, we don't violate the Second Commandment. And the Second Commandment can be read two ways. Jesus said the second of the two great commandments is to love your neighbor as yourself. If you don't want someone pointing a Glock 9mm handgun in your face, don't point one in theirs. That's one. The other is the second commandment of the 10, the prohibition against the making of graven images. Well, when you talk about a firearm, it's a graven image of power. It's a way of dominating others with a graven or hand designed and engineered instrument. I would argue it is an idol in America because it gives us a false sense of power and domination over others. So, you know, this is an indicator of how sick the American evangelical population is. And Garrison Grip, that makes this gun Bible, they call it, brags that they ship cartons of these to churches all across America because pastors are encouraging their people to come to church armed. And this is one of the ways to conceal their weapons.
It's amazing. Like I said, back in the 80s and 90s, I don't believe that would ever happen, but nowadays it does. And it's gotten worse. And like you said, gun culture, I mean, there's a legitimate reason for some people to own guns. Yeah, sure. But this is not a normal behavior in using a gun. It's just incredible. Plus the fact
and
that
that's why, by the way, I took on the film. Yeah. Because when Abigail Disney, yes, I know everybody's asking in their mind, Disney, you mean the Disney? Yeah. Yes, she is the grandniece of
she is.
Walt Disney. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
And she isn't an empty-headed heiress. This is a very capable filmmaker, professional. She has a PhD from Columbia.
Right.
She runs several businesses, production companies. She's quite an accomplished individual. And she came to me and said, you know, I'm not a religious person. I left the church decades ago and have never returned. But she said, I can't imagine that this gun culture among American evangelicals, who are in the top groups, subpopulation groups in America, to have access to firearms or own firearms or to defend unfettered Second Amendment gun rights, and are most resistant to gun regulation. This is evangelicals. Yeah. She said, I can't imagine this comports with who you understand Jesus to be. And she said, I dare you to go on camera and examine this problem with me. And eventually I did. I was very reluctant at first.
So she approached you. Okay.
She did. And I was reluctant because I knew I would be punished for doing that.
Oh yeah. There's a price to pay. Yeah.
It's one thing to challenge the Second Commandment. It's another to challenge the Second Amendment. And I knew I'd be more severely punished for the latter than for the former. Well, and that's why I took on the film project.
Yeah. Share a little bit about what happened in the film is that you met the mother of Jordan Davis. I forgot her name, but
Lucy McBath.
Yeah, Lucy. And Macbeth. So what was that like? I mean, Jordan Davis was a victim of gun violence, and the I'm sorry, what's it called? The stand your ground law or something.
Exactly, exactly.
What was that like to meet this woman and in her grief over her son who was killed absurdly because of gun culture?
When I think of that first encounter, Michael, you saw it play out on the film in real
Yeah.
time, unrehearsed. I didn't even know who was coming to see me.
Oh, yeah.
I knew a woman who had lost her child to gun violence, but I didn't know it was Lucy. I knew nothing about Lucy.
Mm-hmm.
And she came to see me at my ministry headquarters on Capitol Hill. And we met in what we called our prayer garden. It was this little walled-in English patio, very lovely setting. And I greeted her, welcomed her, and she told me the story of how she lost her only child,
Okay.
17-year-old son, whom she had largely raised as a single parent. And he and his friends, three others, 4 boys in all, drive up to, a Quick Mart, what do you call it? Convenience store, like a
Right.
7-Eleven.
7-Eleven, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Not sure it was a 7-Eleven, but something in that genre. They drove up and they were listening to their hip hop music. 3 African-American young men and a white contractor, builder, drives up, shouts at them, tells them to turn down their music. And he was, vile and insulting in saying it. And, like teenage boys do, they said, whatever. And
Right, exactly.
just
Yeah.
roll your window up,
Yeah.
roll your window up. And with that, he reached into his glove compartment, pulled out his 9mm, his Glock pistol, and fired several rounds into the car, killing young Jordan.
Wow,
And I'm
that's
telling you, when I
incredible.
retell this story, Michael, it's waves of emotion, because in hearing this mother describe what it was to lose her child, her only child,
Mm-hmm.
in this kind of hideous act of violence, was overwhelming to me. And remember, we were part of the pro-life movement, Michael. We championed motherhood, the
Mm-hmm.
mother-child bond.
Mm-hmm.
It was a central part of our ethic and morals. And to hear this and think of my friends, colleagues, fellow ministers who were keeping Glock 9mm in their glove compartments, just like that guy did, who would eventually attempt to use the Florida Stand Your Ground law, which allows you to attack another person on the presumption that they are a threat, not that they really are, but that you feel they are a threat.
You just have to feel like it, and then you're justified.
And you can pursue them. It's not that you're in a defensive posture, as in stand your ground, you come after me, I'll shoot you. You are allowed to actually pursue.
Wow.
And that's the defense he used. He would ultimately fail. Literally,
but he didn't.
Thank
but
God.
at first it was a mistrial, right?
That's correct. Yes, that's correct. It was a mistrial.
That must have been just devastating to have that. It sounds like it's a no-brainer. The guy, it's a no-brainer. What's the argument?
Well, here was his argument. His argument was, what was I supposed to do? It was 4 black boys against me.
Oh my gosh.
What would you do if his attorney said, what would you do if 4 black kids?
The racism is just crazy. I mean.
And speaking of, may I tell you about a scene you don't see in the documentary?
Yeah.
There was a proposed scene, but the film crew was chased out of the room when I sat with a number of pastors, ordained clergy, ministers, in a room on the border of Southern Ohio and Northern Kentucky. And as we were talking, first they said, the film crew leaves the room. We don't want them here. So we chased the film crew out. We sat alone. And I asked this collection of ministers, how many of you are armed? Every one of them. Every one of the
Wow.
20 or so around the table were
Yeah.
armed. And I
Yeah.
said, okay, brothers, that's how we speak. I said, brothers, they were all men, of course, conservative evangelicals all. And I said, okay, tell me what leads to you drawing your weapon and shooting to kill?
Mm-hmm.
And there was a lot of uncomfortable body language around the room until finally a man in his early 60s said, I'll tell you, brother. I'll tell you what it is. I said, well, please, brother, help me to understand. When do you draw the weapon and shoot to kill? As a Christian, as a minister of the gospel, as a peacemaker, when do you do that? And he said, well, that has to do with a man's skin color. And I said, okay, brother, tell me, I don't understand. How does skin color factor into this?
Mm-hmm.
If you're presented with what you think is a threat, what difference does it make what the color of his skin is?
Right.
He said, no,
Right.
you don't understand. He said, in this county, a
Oh,
black man knows he doesn't belong in this county. So I don't care how dangerous a white man looks. He's not as dangerous as a black man who's in a place he doesn't belong.
oh my gosh.
And that's what makes the difference for me. And I looked around, I said, brothers, help me here to understand. And they all just kind of looked like resigned, like, that's the way it is here, brother. That's the way it is. So race is a component of this, and we have to face it. And that's why seeing a black woman describe this at the hands of a white man was so unsettling, to the point where it started dismantling all of this for me. And it was a very, very powerful instrument in helping me to understand what was wrong.
Yeah, that's wild. I mean, I'm kind of speechless. I just can't, I can hardly believe. I mean, these people have just thrown out the Jesus' teachings as well. They just totally, I mean, like, oh, that has nothing to do with this. You're in this county. This is different. I'm sure Jesus would agree with us if he was in this county. Whatever they think, they're not even believers. They're not even followers.
No,
that's amazing. So let's pivot a little bit. I want to also cover your experience in Operation Rescue, which we had said is kind of a sit-in organization that organized sit-ins in front of abortion clinics. Later on, it became known as Operation Save America. And what was your role in that organization? What did you end up doing?
Well, mostly, it was a very fluid group. You probably remember that, various personalities would emerge and then retreat, and it was very dynamic and, very personality driven. And I was, from time to time, one of the leaders of, one of the organizers, I should probably say, of some of the massive, large-scale blockades that we called rescues, when we would literally use.
Did you go to, were you involved in 1989 in LA?
No,
okay.
I wasn't. I was just getting involved in the movement at that time. I had done my first rescue in 1988. By 89, I was just finding my way in the movement. It wouldn't be until the early 90s that I really.
Okay, so that was a little bit. I was in 2 rescues in 1989 in LA. So
I was aware of them. I was certainly conscious of them.
Yep.
So I knew what you were up to.
Right.
I wasn't there.
Right.
But eventually I would take a leadership role, especially in Western New York. I was in Wichita for the big one there, Summer of Mercy, we called it.
Right.
But I was one of the principal organizers for the Spring of Life in 1992.
Okay.
In Western New York, where we had thousands of protesters in the streets. We shut down whole parts of the city. We blockaded many clinics. And that's kind of what put me on the national stage, even though I was never actually a leader in Operation Rescue proper. We had a component of that called Western New York Rescue. And
Okay.
I was one of the leaders there, but that put me on the national stage
Right.
repeatedly
Right.
in many other places. So that was my role, was really an organizer, an advisor, a motivational speaker, if you will. You know, I'd get up there to cheer on the troops and get them to the doors and get them to
Right.
hunker down and suffer
Right.
arrest and endure
Yep.
the prosecutions and the jailings. And I was jailed myself, as I know you were.
Yeah.
So that was
Yep.
my
Yeah.
role.
Yep. Okay. So that's Operation Rescue. Later on, well, let's just kind of give a little summary of the documentary, aka Jane Roe. So Jane Roe of Roe v. Wade, her real name was Norma McCorvey, and you knew her personally.
I did.
And sometime, I think it was in the 1995 or 6 or something, she supposedly became a born again Christian, right? Joined the evangelical movement.
That's the story she told. Yes.
That's what she told. But then in AKA Jane Roe, we find out that's not the whole story. And there's a lot of things
Right.
going on behind that most people didn't realize. But what was your relationship with her like, and what happened?
Well, getting to know Norma, and I affectionately referred to her as Sister Norma.
Mm-hmm.
Norma McCorvey, we all know her in her pseudonym, Jane Roe, which was designed to keep her identity anonymous during the notorious 1973 Supreme
Mm-hmm.
Court case that would be known as Roe v. Wade.
Mm-hmm.
And if people know the backstory, I'll tell it very quickly. You know, Norma was alcohol addicted as a young woman in Texas, pregnant in the late 1960s with her third pregnancy, when she was sought out by 2 lawyers who were really looking for the right subject to challenge abortion on the national scale, on the national scene through a Supreme Court case. And they enlisted her involvement in that case, and she became the anonymous Jane Roe, suing the state of Texas for the right to a safe and legal abortion.
Right.
That never happened during her pregnancy, so she actually gave birth to that child. But the long story short is, Norma became an icon in the pro-choice movement until she felt alienated and sometimes exploited within that movement. And she kind of started looking over to the other side. And this
Yeah.
is to understand Norma, because Norma's whole life was the struggle of survival.
Mm-hmm.
She had been terribly abused as a child, both physically and psychologically. She was arrested as a young teenager and put in the old, what did they call them? Reform schools, you
Yeah.
know,
Right.
and was sexually abused there. Then she married a very abusive man when she was 16, who
Mm-hmm.
beat her. And all of this led to a lifetime of survival.
Mm-hmm.
And in a way, she was looking to survive, and she befriended one of the leaders of what had now become known as Operation Save America, Flip Benham. I knew Flip very well. He was what we call a street preacher. You know what that is. You stand up literally on a soapbox and preach wherever you are. And they did have a kind of transactional friendship. They each got something out of the other. And eventually, Flip would baptize Norma in a backyard swimming pool and show her off as a kind of trophy. Here was the icon of the pro-choice movement, now becomes the born-again icon of the pro-life movement.
Right.
And as soon as I heard word of that, I'm sorry and ashamed and regretful of this, and I don't expect any sympathy for it, because it was wrong, period. And it was injurious to a lot of people, including to Norma, but I exploited Norma. When I heard of her conversion to the pro-life cause, I immediately made arrangements for her to come to Washington. I put her on a national stage. I choreographed a moment with Randall Terry where they would hug and kiss each other on the cheek on stage, and we would capture that as a symbol that we had scored the big victory. We brought over the movement figure from the pro-choice to the pro-life camp. And that just became the way Norma was used for the next, well, I lose count of the years, but as many as 20 years, maybe 15, 20 years. And Norma would come to see me in Washington. She called me Pastor Rob. We would talk. I enjoyed Norma. I loved her. And I knew, by the way, she's passed on, for those who aren't aware of that. She's passed on. But Norma would confide in me. And I knew she was at least ambivalent about the pro-life ethic, the pro-life cause, our pro-life beliefs. I knew she harbored pro-choice sensibilities and knew that she couldn't talk about that anymore because she was making a living as a pro-life spokesperson. I knew that, and I was willing to give her the pass. There were bigger problems than that, even bigger problems than that, and that was her long time same-sex relationship with her lesbian partner. That became a problem, but we were all willing to kind of give it a wink and a nod because she was so valuable to our movement as a trophy, and we didn't want to tarnish the trophy.
That blows me away, because like I said, most evangelical churches would have given her the right foot of fellowship, booted her out because she refused to change. Apparently she still drank, she still had this lesbian relationship, and she wasn't really repenting.
And she was smoking, Michael. And
and then also smoking, and that's not
cigarette.
And that's bad
before
too,
speaking at a church sanctuary.
Right.
That was appalling. Never mind the pro-choice stuff. She's smoking a cigarette out in the alley. It was preposterous. It was abusive of us. It was exploitative. It was cheap. It was dehumanizing for her. It was contemptuous of her, and I regret it deeply, and I only wish I could go and beg her pardon, but I can't. She's gone.
No, I know. I mean, in fairness to you, I mean, we were all brainwashed to think that way, that this was a grievous sin, and this person needed to repent, and we have to get her out of this relationship. It's dangerous and all that stuff. And so that's what they told us to do. That's what we did. That's what we thought we were doing, the right thing, I guess. I don't know. I mean, we don't stop and think about it.
No. And in fact, I say today, even though I remain, as you know, an evangelical minister, I've got a certificate on my wall that attests to it.
Right.
So I still identify as an evangelical, but one of the most harmful elements within American evangelicalism is that critical thinking is not only unwelcome, it's considered a vice, not a virtue.
Right.
If you think critically, if you ask too many questions, if you can't come up with pat answers, you're something of a heretic. And you no longer belong.
Yep.
So we couldn't think critically about Norma. We couldn't think about the nuances, the complexities of her life, her experience, her thinking, or her relationships. And as you know, one of my deepest regrets was the role I played in reinforcing her resolve to leave her longtime partner. Because it could not be sustained in the new professional environment that she was in. She had to perform as an actor on the stage, on the pro-life stage, and it wasn't going to work if she had a same-sex partner in life. And so I reinforced her resolve to leave her longtime partner, and that's something that's it's a regret I'll have for the rest of my life.
Yeah. Well, it's a sad story. It's a sad commentary on, for the most part, a lot of well-meaning people. But on the other hand, there's a lot of people that really should know better and it should at least stop and think about it more. I mean, that's the part that blows me away. When I started to look into the whole homosexual issue, I was just amazed how off we were. We were just completely off. I mean, we're not going to talk about that now, but you just do a little study on homosexuality in the Bible, the words that are translated, that word, what's the history of it, what was really going on in those ancient cultures, which was nothing to do with consensual, loving relationships. And Jesus, of course, never mentioned a word about homosexuality.
Nor abortion, by the way, which was widely practiced in the ancient world,
right?
But it's never mentioned.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's just sad. So anyways, you actually made a statement once that just blew me away. You said, when you do what we did to Norma McCorvey, you lose your soul. I mean, what do you mean by that?
Well, first of all, when you treat another human being with contempt, when you objectify them, as we did with Norma in making her a trophy, instead of honoring her humanity,
right,
using her as a prop, you not only insult that human person's dignity and what I refer to as their divine quality. In other words, as a Christian, I believe that every human being is created in the image of God and reflects the nature and beauty of God. And so in reducing someone to a prop, to a trophy, to a canard, something that we blame shift to, we actually disregard our own humanity, because human souls are meant to connect with each other. We're built for community, for family, for relationships, for community. We need and want each other. But when you cut someone off from that soul connection, you diminish yourself.
Yeah.
You starve your own soul to death, and you become inhuman. I might say unhuman, non-human. So that when I say you lose your soul, you lose all your sensibilities about what it means to be human, what it means to be spiritually connected, and you become a two-dimensional actor yourself. So it happened to me in my relationship, or lack of relationship, to Norma, and to many others. And it's especially true when we make others the scapegoats and blame shifting on them. And they do this, they make this, whether it's people coming across the southern border or whether it's non-believers. We separate the world into the lost and the saved.
Us versus them. Yeah.
Us versus, when they become the them and we become the us, we starve one another of the soul connection that keeps human beings human.
And you justify it by dehumanizing the them.
Exactly what we said we wouldn't do in the pro-life movement.
Right. You dehumanize them because they're murderers. They're, practice abomination or whatever, whatever line you'd come up with that justifies treating them that way. It's very sad. So what's your position on abortion now?
Well, it's nuanced. First of all, and my wife, Cheryl, always pokes me under the table and says, here you go. You're talking about Bonhoeffer again. I always find my way to Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who's my
Right.
posthumous spiritual mentor, this
Right.
young, brave, brilliant German church leader I mentioned earlier in our conversation, was one of the first voices to speak out against Adolf Hitler and his mass murderous regime, and would lose his own life when he was hanged in a concentration camp at age 39. By the way, there's a lot of excellent scholarship indicating that Dietrich Bonhoeffer was very likely a closeted gay man. And that
Oh,
just
really?
adds to his dimensionality, I
Okay.
think.
Interesting. Yeah.
But in any case, Dietrich Bonhoeffer really has become my spiritual guide through this phase of my life.
Hmm.
And, Dietrich Bonhoeffer talked about how we have to read the Bible against ourselves and against our own certitude. And that in the end, the question is not even what the Bible has to say, but what is the will of God in this moment? And for me, when it comes to abortion, the reality of people's lives is what in the end truly matters, the reality of their suffering. And I'll give you one example. And this was something I hid away in my memory for more than a decade, but I was thrown in jail in Montgomery, Alabama, in somewhere around 2010 for my protest work. And the jail was overpopulated, so they put me on the psychiatric wing, which of
Okay.
course a lot of people chuckled about and said, that's exactly where you belonged. And yep, not at the expense of the people who were there, but
Right.
okay.
Yeah.
But anyway, I was on the psychiatric wing. And the reason that that's important is because it was the only co-ed wing of the jail. In other words, there were men and women in the same cell block.
Okay.
And so here I was in my cell, and about 3 doors away was a woman who was in deep distress. She was in psychological anguish, and she kept screaming, a Black woman, barely clad. It was a filthy environment. I don't even want to describe what was on the walls. It was filthy. And she was screaming and begging somebody to help her children.
Hmm.
She kept saying, where are my babies? I have 3 kids. Where are my kids? Who has my kids? Who's with my babies? Who's with my children?
Hmm.
And at that point, for 20 plus years, 25 years, I lived in a fantasy world. And in my fantasy world, any woman who was desperate in pregnancy and was experiencing an unwelcome pregnancy, all that woman had to do was cry out, and a whole bevy of rosy-cheeked, white, suburban evangelical women would fly to
Oh,
her
right.
aid.
Right.
They
Right.
would bring baby blankets and
Hmm.
diapers and fanny cream, and they would bring
Hmm.
offers of free babysitting and vouchers for food at the grocery store, and they would bring Christian doctors who would come and offer to take care of her prenatal needs and birth and pediatric needs
Right.
afterward. There was just no problem. In my fantasy life, all a woman had to do was call out for help. Why would any woman want to get an abortion when she could have all this support for
Hmm.
her child? But on that wing of the Montgomery jail in Alabama, I watched a woman scream for help, and no one came to her aid. No one,
Yeah.
not a guard, not a volunteer, not a chaplain. No one ever came to help her. And I secreted that away, but I harbored it for a long time, and I revisited it in my mind thinking, I have no idea of what it means to face a pregnancy under unimaginable conditions. I don't
Right.
care what that is. And later I would hear something else, and this is public, so I'm not telling anything out of school, but Abigail Disney, the heir of a massive American fortune, would tell me about what led her as a young woman to seek an abortion. And she had her own panic, her own fear, unrelated to the woman in Montgomery. There was nothing similar about their circumstances, but they were equally afraid.
Yeah.
And I said, wait a minute. All these years, I've been demanding that my listeners leave their reality and join my fantasy.
Yeah, yeah.
And I came to realize that as a minister of the gospel, my charge was to leave my fantasy and enter their reality, to be with them in their agony, their suffering, their fear, their decision-making process. That's a very complex one. So while I will be honest, I can't really find reason to celebrate abortion, but I respect completely the fact that, one, I can never understand that person's circumstance. I can only empathize. I can only sympathize. I can only be present with them in their reality as close as I can get, but I can never fully experience it as they do. And I most certainly can't experience pregnancy, welcome or unwelcome, because I'm a man. I will never know that. And so I've come to the resolution that the best person to handle this crisis is the woman who is pregnant, with whatever advisor she decides of her own power and agency to call upon, whether that's a pastor, whether that's a doctor, whether that's a friend, whether that's a therapist, whoever it might be. That's entirely her prerogative as a human being, as someone with full agency. And my job is to respect her, even if she makes a decision I would not make in my fantasy life.
Right.
But what matters is not my fantasy and imagination. What matters is her reality. So I've resolved that. I'm with you, whether I like it or not, embrace it or not. My job is to love you, support you, and to be present with you if you wish that. Otherwise, it's to stay out of your life. And that's the way I honor that very complex, difficult course that a woman makes in her life.
Right.
And I don't try to impose anything on that person anymore.
It's a very good point. We just try to, we impose our moral way of looking at it on everyone, and people who are in the pro-life or anti-abortion movement are just so black and white about it. It's always murder, it's always wrong. And even if you vote for Joe Biden because he's pro-choice, you're a murderer too. You're just the same. It's a moral sin. I mean, it gets so
I get those email messages every day. Now.
It gets so
nearly
absurd,
every day.
They don't even think about what really counts. And like you said, what is it really like? And well, there's a whole bunch of issues that you could get into, and I'm starting to write about it myself. So maybe another time we can compare notes. But we're almost out of time. But there was one more question I wanted to ask, and that's, what is your message for your for evangelicals? You're on the fringes. I wouldn't even call you an evangelical, even though you might use the term, because it's so outside of what my experience was. It doesn't sound like a typical evangelical at all. But what's your message for those people that you used to be in connection with very closely?
Well, I still speak in the mother tongue.
Yeah.
So I'll often say, to my fellow evangelicals, first of all, I've learned at this stage of my life, I'm 64, and it's taken me, a lot of years to get to the place of realizing how far I had drifted from Jesus, from the centrality of Jesus in my life, in my belief system, in the model that he must be for every Christian, because Christians are Christ-centered. So what matters is not what the latest and most popular political celebrity is doing. What matters is what Jesus says and does.
Mm-hmm.
And, God himself calls us to return to our first love, to the first of our, when Jesus was asked of all the commandments in the Bible, and there are more than 600 of them, which are the most important? And his answer, as you know well, because you expounded on this as much as I did during our shared ministry careers, he answered, they are two. The first is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And he said the second is like it. And a lot of translators will render that the second is the same as it.
Mm-hmm.
Love your neighbor as yourself. And he said, contained in these two are all of the commandments. So really nothing else matters, is what Jesus says.
Right. Exactly.
Love God and love people.
And including your enemy, and
including your enemy. He says, love your enemy.
Right.
So we don't even have that excuse to exempt us from
exactly.
love, from an ethic of love. And
No.
love is limitless. And the Bible says God is love. So the very nature of God is love. And not long ago, I had an atheist couple ask me, as a minister, can you officiate our wedding? Can you solemnize our marriage?
Right.
And I said, well, do you love each other? And they said, yes. I said, well, that's good enough for me, because the Bible says God is love. Wherever love is, God is. And wherever God is, love is. So it's okay with me, so long as there's love on the table.
There you go. Very good.
So I do. I say, let's go back to the very beginning and look at Jesus and the centrality of his ministry, his message, his model, and get back there. And that helps. That helps. And of course, I also remind them of what's said in the New Testament book of James, that we have to look at ourselves in the mirror.
Right.
And behold what kind of person we really are, not who we imagine ourselves to be, and even worse, imagine others to be, but who we really are, face ourselves. That's the most difficult thing I think we can do in life, is face ourselves, who we really are, what we really are, admit to it. But that's where, for an evangelical, it's where salvation begins, is saying, God, I got it wrong. I'm a sinner. I made a mistake. I'm coming to you and asking for mercy. And I say, when we think we're all right, everything we believe is right and is the right thing, and everybody else is wrong, we're no longer a Christian, because the Christian confesses not that I'm right, but that I'm wrong.
Right.
And that's why I need a savior. So, I think American evangelicals need a very strong dose of self-doubt, of humility, if you will, rather than the pride and the arrogance and the certitude that we've been exerting now for decades, and is doing an enormous amount of harm in the world.
Right. That's a great word, Rob. Good thing to finish on. Really enjoyed our conversation. Where can people find your book and these two documentaries and learn more?
Well, thanks for asking. You have two options. One is revrobschenck.com, and you have to spell it like the Dutch do, with the two C's, S-C-H-E-N.
Oh, right. And I got that wrong. That's the C-K on the end.
You made it the German spelling rather than the Dutch. But revrobschenck.com, and the other is TDBI. It stands for the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Institute, TDBI.org. So either one, revrobschenck.com.
All right. Okay. There you go, folks.
Or TDBI.org, which is our organization.
Just Google Armor of Light, or AKA Jane Roe, which is on Hulu, I believe. And those are great films, really eye-opening. So thank you, Rob, so much for joining us here at the Spiritual Brew Pub. and it's a little bit too early in the morning. We didn't have our beer together, but but we
Thanks.
sometimes do that here.
The
And
conversation was a
I'm sure
tonic enough.
Dietrich had some good German lagers, right? Right.
Oh,
Okay.
he loved his alcohol and his tobacco.
Yeah. Right. All right. Tobacco, but not
He did.
Norma.
He
You couldn't
loved
have Norma
both.
do it.
Right.
Right. Okay. Thank you so much, folks. It's been a great time. Again, check back with us later for the next episode of the Spiritual Brew Pub, and enjoy responsibly.